Fantastic. What a great range of backgrounds that you come from, and you'll be able to share your experiences with us today. So what I'm going to do is get Cathy to introduce herself, because she's got a little thing to run through first, and then I'll launch into the morning.
Yeah, God, just echo Claire. What an incredible range of professions and skill sets within this room. And thank you all for spending your time on this day with us. It's clearly something that we are both really passionate about. We consider it to be really, really important, and it's an honour to kind of have you all here. So, morena, everybody. My name's Cathy. I've been doing work in the kind of sexual violence sector for many, many years now, and work primarily, when I'm not doing that, with young people in student health, and work a lot in the mental health area as well. And those areas, you know, there's a whole lot of links that happen in that space. I just wanted to start by talking about a case that stays with me, and that I think I take with me actually every day I go to work, and it really illustrates why, from a primary care perspective especially, this is such an important part of what we do. And actually being brave enough to ask questions and inquire, even when it feels really difficult, is exactly what we should be doing. And this was a case that came to me probably about 10 years ago and was brought to the Sexual Assault Service in Wellington when I was on call by the police. And she was a woman in her early 30s, and the police said, look, this is quite a traumatic story, and we're just going to leave her with you and see how you go, and she may or may not want to have a forensic examination. So we started talking, and what struck me first is how incredibly quietly she spoke. She really found it very difficult to kind of look up and speak at any sort of volume that I could hear easily, actually. And her story started to come out, and then actually I think she found that she couldn't stop telling it, and it went on for about 2 hours, the story of what had happened to her. And she had met her partner when she was about 18 and he was nearly 30. And she was a very bright young woman, and her parents had said, we don't really like this guy, we're not sure about him, and therefore I think, as a lot of 18-year-olds do, she went, damn you, I'm going to make sure that this happens then. So off they went, and they ended up getting married, and he gradually started to become very controlling. And as is often the case, I think, in these situations, the first thing he did was really isolate her from her family and friends. So she ended up really just only having him in her world. He then became physically abusive. And, you know, if things weren't perfect at home, he would hit her or slap her or, you know, hurt her in other ways. And he then started to become sexually violent. And by the time I saw her, you know, many years later into this marriage, she had had 5 children who were all born out of sexual assault. She'd had about 17 fractures, she'd had numerous head injuries, she'd been admitted to hospital again and again and again. Every time she had been seen at a doctor's or at the hospital, he would be waiting outside with one of the kids, and he would say to her, if you say anything, I've got our son or daughter or whoever it was with. So she never ever managed to do anything until this particular evening where she realised that he was going to kill her and quite possibly the children. And actually, she's right. I suspect she would have been another awful statistic had she not somehow managed to find the resources to actually get out of that situation. And what struck me months later, when I was actually still seeing her in general practice, she came to me sort of for follow-up for a long time before this case went to court, was actually how many contacts she had had with all of us, you know, with Plunkett, with the nurses doing the immunisations for the babies, with the midwives, with the GPs, with the teachers at school, with her neighbours and her family members, when she obviously had injuries and was obviously incredibly traumatised. And I said to her once, when I knew her quite well, and I said, you know, what would have helped you to leave earlier? What would it have been? And she said, I just needed to be asked. That's all I needed. I needed someone to ask me, because he told me I didn't have a voice. So I couldn't speak out myself and say that I needed help. And I carry that with me because I think actually we're the people that can ask. We're in a uniquely privileged position when we have people sitting with us to actually ask the question. And yes, it feels difficult and uncomfortable, and it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but it actually is our responsibility. And she is doing incredibly well. And, you know, this was a story with a happy ending, but it could have been very, very different. And it's certainly a big part of why, you know, these cases, I think, why we keep on doing this work, even though, you know, sometimes a call at 4 a.m. is not what you feel like. But it's a really important thing, and it's really important that you're here today. And, yeah, we really acknowledge that. And also, just briefly, I'm sure Claire will touch on this, but this work is hard. You know, it's hard for you to hear these stories. It's hard to be here. It's hard when it's happening in your practice. So look after yourselves and look after each other. Anyone needs to step out, it's absolutely fine. There's lots of support numbers we'll give you throughout the day, so don't be afraid to get help for yourself as well as your patients if you ever need that. Thank you.
So Cathy's story kind of focuses the day for us and just reminds us why we're all here. the first thing I want to say is because family violence is really common, it means that for all of us here, we may have experienced it ourselves, or we may have had a family member or grown up with cousins or uncles or aunts. And so we've got our own experiences that we bring to all of these meetings, and I acknowledge that. And as Cathy said, the toilets are out there, and you may have to go to the toilet, and that's not a problem. So I'm just acknowledging that. So how did I get into this work? I think it's quite important to explain I started in rural general practice down in Southland. So I was a rural GP, and I had a couple of friends who were my buddies when I was having my babies in New Zealand with no family, because I'm from the UK, in rural Southland. And they both were doing sexual assault work. So they said, come on, you can do this too. So that's how I started doing the sexual assault work about 23 years ago. And after I moved to Christchurch, I got involved in DSAC, which is now known as MedSAC, the training and education provider in sexual assault. And they picked up a contract with the Ministry of Health to do some family violence education, particularly intimate partner violence education with GPs and practice nurses. So that was in the about 2002, 2003. And that was actually before the VIP program in the hospitals. So we kind of developed in parallel, if you like. And I've remained interested in this area of healthcare for a long time. And I feel like we're on a wave at the moment in primary care, that it's being recognised that we need a bit of funding, we need education, we need support. So the presentation this morning is sort of an amalgamation of different presentations I've done. And it is focused on primary care doctors and nurses, because that's what we had focused the day on. But I acknowledge that you're all coming from different places, and that's fine. And your contribution will be very welcome too. So let me see if I can get this going. So this is just the boring old, this is what I hope at the end of the day or the end of the morning, if somebody asked you about what did you get out of the day, you got a bit out about understanding about refocusing how family violence and intimate partner violence in particular affects health. And I think it's a really important thing. Sorry. This could be a theme. It's really important to recognise that I apologise, that family violence drives ill health. It's not a contributing factor, it's in the driving seat. It's what people carry with them, and it affects their health and their family's health. And police have got that understanding now, and they've moved it to the centre of their thinking. And I think in health we need to do. So at the end of the morning, I hope that you'll feel more empowered to know how to ask questions and what to do with the answers. As Brian mentioned, I'm a clinical editor for Health Pathways, and we started Health Pathways in Canterbury, and I'm a passionate supporter of it because it's a great way of sharing information, particularly about topics that you don't have at your fingertips. And if you use Health Pathways, you can find the latest information about this, that, or the other, but it also can give you your local resource options, because we all come from different places. What I tell you about Christchurch isn't going to help you, but on your Health Pathways, you'll be able to find that information. And I think only the Hamilton area now doesn't have Health Pathways. In Hamilton, I'll come to it later on, you can actually access a standalone website which will give you some of the information, just not the referral options. I'll show you later. So a bit like Cathy, we've got Amy, who's 29, and she comes to see you in your primary care role, and she said that she was assaulted by her ex-partner yesterday, and she was told to see a doctor to record the injuries. So that's somebody fronting up in primary care, and you might be thinking, is this actually my job, to record injuries? And then, if you've decided yes it is, how would you approach it? Because it's certainly not what I learnt at medical school, and I'm sure you didn't learn in your training either. So just hold on to that case, and we'll come back to it later this morning. I think it's quite useful to think about, can you see okay there? I'm not in the way.
I find that if you want something to chew on.
Oh, you're just lovely, thank you. I think words can trip us up, and words have changed during the time I've been involved in this sector. But this is a little diagram that I put together to kind of help my brain. So family violence is talking about child abuse and neglect and vulnerable children. It's covering elder abuse as well as intimate partner abuse. Sexual assault stands overlying it, but also as a separate issue. today what we're focusing on particularly is intimate partner abuse and sexual assault. Definitions kind of focus us a bit. This is actually a definition from America, and I really like it apart from the word battering, but it's a pattern of coercive behaviours. So it's not an incident, it's a pattern of behaviours that may include repeated battering or injury, as we would know it, psychological abuse, sexual assault, progressive social isolation, as talked about by Cathy, deprivation of rights and physical things, and intimidation. And these behaviours are perpetrated by someone who is or was involved in an intimate relationship with the victim. And I think that covers it. The reason I've put the psychological bit in bold is because for most people they will say that is the most difficult bit. That is the bit that does them in. I think it's worthwhile thinking, often we think, oh, I kind of understand but I'm not sure. But I really got to sort of put myself in someone's shoes when I thought about bullying. If you think about bullying for any of us, most of us have either been bullied, witnessed bullying, or been a bullier. If you think about school, primary school, high school, and then when you go through your training organisation, and when you work in health, I have to say there's a lot of bullying. But that means we understand the dynamics of bullying. We know what it's like to be bullied. We know what it feels like. We also know what it's like to stand and not quite know what to do about it, or to avoid it by moving yourself out. You also sometimes understand what it is like to bully. Now, bullying is not at all the same as intimate partner violence, but the dynamics are the same. There's power imbalance which has allowed it to happen. And I think if you're struggling to get your head around why these things are happening, think about bullying, because it is something we all do know about. How common is this? I think it's really important to recognise that the New Zealand police are very, very heavily involved in family violence. But it's also really important to acknowledge that only 76 to 80% of family violence won't ever reach the police. I think that's really important because we hear about it and read about it, but so much never gets to the police. So it's never getting to that state. It's all down underneath. So who's vulnerable? Who's vulnerable to intimate partner violence? Lots and lots of people are. In particular, people who are different in some way or who don't have the same advantages. So that can be immigrant populations. That can be people who are in same-sex relationships, people who have a disability. They're very, very vulnerable. All of us are vulnerable, but some are more vulnerable than others. And we need to look out for that and to think about that and to think about if somebody has a disability, for example, whenever they go to a health service provider, they're brought by someone else. So how do they ever talk about what's going on when they've always got a companion with them, caring for them? So thinking about what's happening and how you can make people safe to talk to them in a safe way and find out about what's happening in their lives. This is another issue that's really important to get your head around, gendered violence. So the Dunedin longitudinal study produced some research saying women are as violent as men. And this was very brave of them actually, because it didn't go well with the sector at all. But what they were using was something called the conflict tactics scale. And if you understand a little bit about it, you can see how they got the results that they did. So with using this scale, you get 1 point for an act of violence. So hitting is 1 point, pushing is a point, that kind of thing. And it's also only used in cohabiting couples. So none of the research was done in people who aren't actually living together. So that excludes a lot of the people we're talking about. It misses all the violence associated with separation when people separate. And that's one of the most risky times. It also ignores the context of the violence. It has no way to include that. So it doesn't really allow people to talk about what was the context in which the violence occurred, that often for women it is used in self-defense, but that isn't counted. And it also ignores the meaning of the violence, and that for most people who are in a relationship where there is violence, if you ask the men, they're not usually frightened of their partner. So their partner may hit them, may thump them, may shout at them, but they're not usually frightened of them. Whereas for most women, you'll find that they will express fear. So that kind of thing is not counted within the conflict tactics scale. It also ignores the impact. And if you look at family violence death statistics, yes, there is the occasional woman who kills a male partner, but the vast majority of the deaths that occur in this context are where a male has killed a female. So I'm not denying at all that women are not violent. I'm not saying they're not violent at all, but what I'm saying is the context in which the violence occurs is not usually the same. Now, this is I'm supposed to ask you this question and you're supposed to give me the answer. But obviously it didn't come in right, I apologise. But that's a heck of a lot, isn't it? 1 in 3 people. So how many of your patients does that mean that you don't know about it? And this information comes from research in New Zealand. It's not, in America where they're killing each other all the time. It's here in New Zealand. So very important to get our heads around that. I think thinking about the dynamics of intimate partner violence is really helpful for us to try and get alongside our patients and imagine what things are like for them. And perhaps somebody on this table can say what they think of that picture there. What's that telling you? What does it mean to you, that poster?
Verbally abusive. It's just as powerful.
Yeah.
Painful.
Yeah. I think that's a very good photo because it is illustrating that it's not just about physical violence, it's about words and behaviour as well. So 2 words to get your heads around are coercion and control. Okay? So coercive control is a pattern of domination that includes tactics to isolate, thinking about Cathy's patient, degrade, exploit and control someone, as well as to frighten or hurt them physically. So if you think about the bullying again, you can see how those tactics work in that dynamic as well. And the reason we've got rocks here is because it's incidents. And when you have lots of incidents, and each incident by itself, when it's related to you, might not sound terrible, but when you put them all in together, it results in an accumulation of harm and a great big weight that people are carrying around with them. So it's a good idea, rather than to talk about family harm incidents or intimate partner violence incidents, is to recognise that they're actually a series of episodes which all add up and pile on top. Somebody's carrying those rocks round with them, trying to live their lives. Okay. Thinking about the tactics of abuse is quite helpful because for most people, they won't describe all of these things. And so you'll be thinking, no, she's not saying, she's not really saying that she's been isolated, but there's a whole lot of different tactics that are used, and you'll find that people experience different aspects of this at different times in the relationship, and sometimes different times on the same day. So thinking about isolating tactics, often young women in particular will say, I got my boyfriend and he made me so special and I was treated like a princess and he wanted to care for me and he wanted to look after me and he wanted to be everywhere with me and make sure I was treated well, and in retrospect slowly lost contact with their friends. There are other friends who perhaps didn't have boyfriends, so they had less in contact with them, and they become much more isolated, not allowed to contact their friends anymore. So it moves from being a princess into being a princess that's imprisoned, if that makes sense. Does anybody know what gaslighting is? No?
Power control, isn't
It is, yeah. It's about mind games, actually, and the term comes from a play that was actually written in the UK in the 1930s, I think, and it was all about how a man controlled his wife, but basically he ended up making her feel that it was all her fault. She was mad, that she was imagining all these things. And that's exactly what can happen in these relationships, that the person who is the victim can end up thinking it's all their fault and that they're mad, and that this person they're with can behave beautifully outside and everybody else says, what are you talking about? He's so nice to you. But at home, this is what's going on. Often these tactics are not displayed in front of other people. They're at home. This is what's going on at home. Does anybody know what the hearts and flowers is about at the bottom right-hand corner here? No? That's about the dynamic nature of a relationship whereby you usually get an escalation in violence and abuse, and then an explosion, an event or an episode, and then it's all, I'm so sorry, you know, it's been really busy at work, and you know, kids have been getting on my back, and here's some flowers to make up for it, I'll never do that again. You're my angel, I love you. So that's what the hearts and flowers is about. And of course, they've got together, and the woman usually loves this other person. So they forgive them. Who wouldn't, you know? That's what you're in a relationship for. So I think the other thing that's really helpful is to get in alongside someone and say, it must be really hard when this is someone you love. Because they're telling you a story and they're thinking, you must think I'm mad. But you don't. You understand, because this is being done by somebody they love. And I say that, and you can see people's shoulders go down because they think, oh, okay, she's not judging me, she gets it. This is the escalating pattern of harm, and I think this is quite a good diagram because it shows that the relationship starts at the beginning on the purple ribbon, and you go through these cycles whereby at the top there, where the angry faces are, that's where you've had an explosive episode. And then you go down and the tension goes down and you often get your box of chocolates and your flowers, and then it goes up again. And I think this is a good diagram because it shows not only how one relationship goes between two people, but it also illustrates what happens when that relationship ends and both of them go to a new relationship and the same thing happens. So it happens in cycles like that as well. So recognising that is quite important. And one of the things that I often do when I'm seeing women in this situation is sit down with them and just spend 5 minutes saying, tell me about yourself. I get a piece of paper and I say, oh, you know, do you come from around here? Where were you born? Who was at home when you were growing up? Where did you live? And then just go through, what was it like at school? Which was your favourite school? And they'll often say a primary school, because life was easier then. And then go through their teenage years, when did they first have relationships, and reflect with them how they've got where they are. And I think that's a really helpful way of letting them see this, but also recognising that it's not their fault, that lots of things have happened to them in the past that have affected what's happening now. And so it's not just about what's happening now, it's about all the journey you've come on and amazing things you've done on the way, which I always try and find as well. What do people do? What do women do when they're in these relationships? Well, they do try to resist things, sometimes overtly, and that might be physically fighting back, or refusing to do things, or refusing to come home, not coming home when they're supposed to come home. So those can be overt resistance, if you like. Sometimes they leave. How many times do people take on average, women take on average in leaving? How many times do they leave before they finally leave? Anybody have any idea? On average? 7 or 8 times. And that's, if you think about it, just like smoking. How many times does it take someone to quit before they quit? It's just a behaviour, isn't it? So really important to remember it doesn't all happen. The other ways people resist is by trying to manage what's going on and trying to manage and protect themselves, dull the pain. That's often about alcohol and drugs. So anyone working in an alcohol and drug service needs to be thinking, what's going on that this person's got into this situation? What's underneath? What's behind? What's happened? Sometimes people will talk to someone. They'll see an advert on the TV or they'll see a poster at work, and that somebody just says, "You all right? What happened to your face?" And then they'll open up. So sometimes they do share. Often they'll share and say, "But I don't want to go and see anyone else. I don't want to talk to anyone," but they will share. Sometimes they'll do anything to avoid a conflict. So they'll really become very quiet and not say anything back in order to avoid a conflict. Sometimes they'll stay at the workplace. People who are staying late at work, what's going on there? What are they not going home to? And often they'll offer excuses. It's because he had a bad day, it's because I was late home, it's because the kids were so naughty. And they just offer excuses as a way of coping too. What about the effects? This is some of the health effects and some of the behavioural effects. Thinking about bullying again, you can see lots of these things there. So self-blame. If you think about, if you've ever dealt with children who are being bullied, they'll say, "It's my fault, I'm stupid." I'm not pretty, I'm dumb, I'm dull, I'm whatever. And just imagine that in the adult. That's exactly what's happening. They normalise and minimise the behaviours. You know, I was late with the dinner. So, you know, no wonder he was hungry, he'd been at work all day, you know. So they minimise what's happening. But for us, I think it's really important to think about the physical health effects, and particularly the trauma and PTSD effects. So repeated trauma can give you PTSD. PTSD gives you lots of flashbacks, lots of repeated behaviours to cope with what's happened to you before. People who self-harm. Self-harming is about getting the pain out from in here, to somewhere, to get it out in a different way. What's going on with people who self-harm? Adults as well as young people. A whole range of different sorts of effects can come out. Now, I think it's very helpful to hear from women who are in relationships like this. Now, of course, I don't bring people in and say, can you tell us your story? But there is a really, really good DVD that's been put out by the Ministry of Justice. You can get it from the Family Court, and it's talking about family violence. It's maybe about 6 or 7 years old now, but it's a really good DVD, and it's for women talking about their experience of family violence and talking about positive change and talking about what's made differences for them. So I think much better than I could ever tell you, those women tell you why they're staying. And it's totally understandable. And I think the woman at the end saying, I think he does love me, it's just that he doesn't respect me. That's such a resonant thing. And I think if we can express that too, it's very helpful for patients, because then they see that we understand them, we're not judging them, we're not thinking they're stupid. Just like we shouldn't be judging people who are smoking or whatever else, we're trying to help them and see what can we do to help you. So understanding those dynamics is very, very important. So, this is not working in terms of my little shoot-ins, but never mind. So down the left-hand side, that kind of summarises why people don't leave. They're fearful about what might happen if they do. They might be killed, and they're very right that they might be killed. Financial reasons. They don't have the financial security or independence to be able to leave. They don't control the money. Family reasons. There was a couple in there that said, you know, my family said, oh, you'll be right. No, hang in there, he's all right, you know, come right. Reasons of faith. People who have a strong faith themselves and belong in a community where their faith is very important. It's very difficult to leave a community like that. It takes a huge amount of courage. A father. All children deserve a father. He's a great father. The kids love him. He's so good with them. Also, I'm thinking, it's very hard, solo parenting. So for those reasons, and I think people don't understand about the effect on children. They think he hasn't hit the children, therefore they're not affected. But our thinking is changing totally on that. Reasons of fantasy, they talked about that. They talked about how it's going to get better. He's going to come right next year, once the kids are grown up, all of those things. Fatigue. All of us know what it's like to be fatigued. We all know what it's like when work's really hard and you know you should go out for that run, or you should do this, or you should do that, and it's just too exhausting. Imagine life with that bag of stones on your back, trying to make any changes and trying to do anything beyond get out of bed in the morning and get the kids to school and get some food on the table is really, really hard. It's my fault. It's my fault. I'm useless, that gaslighting thing. Really, really very powerful thing. And lastly, the fuel, which is about drugs and alcohol and access to those. And often within a relationship, they've grown together within their relationship where drugs and alcohol are a really potent part of the relationship. And so dealing with that is a really important thing as well. But on the right-hand side, it's very interesting because we've always talked about why doesn't she leave? But actually what we should be saying, why doesn't the abusive person stop the violent and controlling behaviour? So we need to think about that. And I think that as a society in New Zealand, we are starting to think about that. And these people are not born like that. They've had their journey, which has impacted on their lives, which has taught them how to behave and what to do when they want to get their way. And so we need to address those things as well. And particularly when people do love each other, They don't want to be necessarily separated forever. They actually just want the behaviour to change.